Joe Martinez never expected that stopping to help a stranded motorist on a rainy Tuesday evening would become the most important decision of his life. When his 16-year-old son Marcus found himself standing before a judge 6 months later, falsely accused of vandalism that could destroy his college dreams, Joe had no idea that the woman in the black robes was the same person he'd helped change a tire in the pouring rain. She remembered everything: how he'd gotten soaked helping a complete stranger, how he'd refused her offer of money, and how he'd simply said, "Pay it forward," before disappearing into the storm. Now, as she held Marcus's fate in her hands, Judge Catherine Reynolds had the perfect opportunity to do exactly that. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button for more real, emotional, life-changing stories like this, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The rain hammered against Joe Martinez's windshield as he drove home from his second job at the warehouse, the rhythmic thrum of droplets matching the exhaustion that had settled deep in his bones. At 38, Joe carried the weight of single parenthood like a badge of honor and a burden all at once. His calloused hands gripped the steering wheel as he navigated the winding road that led to his modest apartment, where his 16-year-old son Marcus waited with homework spread across their kitchen table and dreams of college that seemed to grow more expensive by the day. The headlights of his aging Ford pickup cut through the darkness, illuminating sheets of rain that had been falling steadily for hours. Joe's thoughts drifted to the conversation he'd had with Marcus that morning over breakfast, cereal eaten standing up because they were both running late. His son had shown him the acceptance letter from the state university, the one that had arrived 3 weeks ago and still sat on their refrigerator like a golden ticket they weren't sure they could afford to use. Marcus had the grades, the determination, and the character that would take him far in life. But the financial reality of college tuition felt like a mountain too steep to climb on a warehouse worker's salary. As Joe rounded a particularly sharp curve, his headlights caught something that made him slow down immediately. A car sat pulled over on the shoulder, its hazard lights blinking like a distress signal in the storm. Steam rose from under the hood, and Joe could make out a figure standing beside the vehicle, hunched against the rain. Without hesitation, he pulled over, his truck's tires crunching on the wet gravel as he came to a stop behind the stranded car. The woman standing beside the disabled vehicle was perhaps in her early 60s, her silver hair plastered to her head by the rain despite the umbrella she held. She wore a simple navy blue dress that suggested she'd been coming from somewhere important, and her posture spoke of someone accustomed to handling difficult situations with grace. When Joe stepped out of his truck, pulling his baseball cap low over his eyes, she looked up with a mixture of relief and wariness that spoke to a lifetime of caution. "Looks like you're having some trouble," Joe called out, raising his voice over the sound of rain drumming on metal and asphalt. He approached slowly, his work boots splashing through puddles that had formed in the uneven shoulder of the road. "I'm Joe Martinez, and I've got some tools in my truck if you need help." The woman's expression softened slightly, though she maintained the careful distance that wisdom had taught her. "Catherine Reynolds," she replied, lowering her umbrella slightly. "I think it's the tire, but I'm not entirely sure. I was driving home from dinner with friends when I heard this terrible noise, and then the car started pulling to the left." Joe nodded, already moving toward her car to assess the situation. The front passenger tire was completely flat, the rubber clinging to the rim like a deflated balloon. Rain continued to fall steadily, turning the simple task of changing a tire into a challenging ordeal that would leave both of them soaked to the bone. "Definitely the tire," he confirmed, squinting through the rain. "Do you have a spare?" Catherine nodded toward her trunk. "I think so, but I have to admit, I've never changed a tire before. My husband always handled these sorts of things, and since he passed, I've been meaning to learn but never quite got around to it." There was no self-pity in her voice, just the practical acknowledgement of a skill gap that had suddenly become relevant. "No problem at all," Joe said, his natural kindness overriding the discomfort of the cold rain soaking through his work shirt. "Let me get my jack and some tools, and we'll have you back on the road in no time." He jogged back to his truck, his boots squelching in the mud, and retrieved his toolbox and a more reliable jack than the compact one that likely came with her car. As Joe worked, Catherine held the umbrella over him as best she could, though the wind kept shifting the rain in all directions. She watched him work with quiet fascination, noting the practiced efficiency with which he loosened the lug nuts, positioned the jack, and lifted the car. His movement spoke of someone who had spent years working with his hands. Someone who understood that sometimes the most important work happened in parking lots and on roadsides, far from the spotlight of recognition. "You don't have to stay out here in the rain," Joe said, as he wrestled with a particularly stubborn lug nut. "You can wait in your car where it's dry. This might take a few more minutes." Catherine shook her head, adjusting her grip on the umbrella. "The least I can do is try to keep some of the rain off you. Besides, I want to learn how to do this in case it happens again." She paused, watching as Joe's muscles strained against the resistant bolt. "Are you sure you don't want me to call someone? I could pay for a tow truck or a professional service. Honestly, by the time someone gets out here in this weather, you'd be waiting for hours," Joe replied, finally getting the shatter. "Stubborn nut loose. And this is really not that complicated once you know what you're doing. The hardest part is usually getting the lug nuts loose, and we're past that now." He worked the flat tire off the hub, his shirt now completely soaked through and clinging to his frame. The spare tire was in good condition, and Joe had it mounted, and the lug nuts tightened within another 10 minutes. Throughout the process, Catherine found herself impressed, not just by his mechanical skill, but by his attitude. He worked without complaint despite the miserable conditions, took time to explain what he was doing, and refused to let her feel like a burden, despite the fact that he was clearly sacrificing his own comfort to help a complete stranger. "I can't thank you enough," Catherine said, as Joe lowered the jack and began collecting his tools. "You have no idea how much this means to me. I was starting to think I'd be stuck out here for hours." She reached into her purse, pulling out her wallet. "Please, let me pay you for your time and trouble. You've gone above and beyond what anyone should expect from a stranger." Joe straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag that was already soaked with rain. "I appreciate the offer, but I can't take your money. I've got a son, and I hope that if he's ever stuck somewhere, someone would stop to help him out too." He smiled, the expression transforming his tired features. "Just pay it forward when you get the chance." Catherine felt something stir in her chest, an emotion she couldn't quite name but recognized as significant. In her professional life, she had dealt with people who helped others for money, for recognition, for personal gain. But here was a man who had stopped in a storm to help a stranger and wanted nothing in return except the hope that kindness might be passed along. "You mentioned a son," she said, curiosity getting the better of her professional reserve. "How old is he?" 16, Joe replied, his face lighting up with unmistakable pride. "Marcus. He's a good kid, smart as a whip, wants to study engineering in college. He's got the grades for it too, honor roll every semester." The rain continued to fall, but Joe seemed to forget about his discomfort when talking about his son. "I'm working 2 jobs trying to save up for his tuition. But you know how it is. College costs keep going up faster than wages." Catherine nodded, understanding more than Joe could know about the challenges facing working families. "Engineering is a wonderful field. Your son is lucky to have a father who supports his dreams." She paused, struck by an impulse that surprised her. "What's your last name, Joe? I'd like to remember the name of the man who helped me tonight." "Martinez," Joe replied, gathering the last of his tools. "Joe Martinez, and you're Catherine Reynolds. It's been a pleasure meeting you, even under these circumstances." He extended his hand, and she shook it firmly, noting the strength and honesty in his grip. As Joe loaded his tools back into his truck, Catherine stood by her car, watching him prepare to leave. The rain had begun to lighten slightly, but both of them were thoroughly soaked. She found herself reluctant to see him go, this stranger who had appeared out of the storm like some sort of guardian angel. "Joe," she called out as he opened his truck door. "Thank you again. I won't forget this." Joe nodded, touching the brim of his cap in a gesture that was both old-fashioned and somehow perfect for the moment. "Drive safe, Catherine. And don't forget to get that tire properly repaired tomorrow. The spare will get you home, but it's not meant for long-term use." With that, he climbed into his truck, started the engine, and pulled away, his taillights disappearing into the rain-soaked darkness. Catherine stood alone on the roadside for a moment, processing what had just happened. In her career as a judge, she had seen humanity at its worst and its best. But there was something about Joe Martinez that had touched her in a way she hadn't expected. His kindness had been genuine, uncomplicated by ulterior motives or expectations of reward. As she got back into her car and started the engine, she made a mental note to herself to remember this moment, to remember that there were still people in the world who helped others simply because it was the right thing to do. The drive home gave Catherine time to think about the encounter, replaying the conversation, and Joe's obvious love for his son. She had spent decades making decisions that affected people's lives, weighing evidence, and applying the law with careful consideration for justice and mercy. But tonight, she had been on the receiving end of an act of pure kindness, and it had reminded her of something she sometimes forgot in the formal atmosphere of the courtroom. That the best of humanity often revealed itself in the smallest, most unexpected moments. Meanwhile, Joe drove home through the diminishing rain, his clothes still damp, but his spirits surprisingly lifted by the encounter. There was something about Catherine Reynolds that suggested she was more than she appeared, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. She had carried herself with a quiet authority that spoke of someone accustomed to responsibility and respect, but she had also shown genuine gratitude for his help. As he pulled into the parking lot of his apartment complex, Joe reflected on how good it felt to be able to help someone, to use his skills and knowledge to solve a problem for another person. Marcus was waiting up when Joe walked through the door, his textbooks spread across the kitchen table, in an organized chaos that spoke to a mind engaged in serious study. The teenager looked up as his father entered, taking in the wet clothes and the satisfied expression on Joe's face. "Dad, you look like you got caught in a flood. What happened?" Joe smiled, hanging his damp jacket on the back of a chair. "Helped a lady change a tire on the way home. She was stuck on the side of the road in all that rain." He moved to the coffee maker, preparing to make himself a cup to warm up. "Nice woman. Reminded me a bit of your grandmother, the way she carried herself." Marcus nodded, returning his attention to his calculus homework. "That was nice of you. Mom always said you couldn't drive past someone who needed help." The mention of his mother was casual, comfortable, the kind of reference that showed how well Marcus had processed his grief and integrated his parents' values into his own worldview. "Your mom was right about that," Joe agreed, settling into the chair across from his son. "She used to say that we're all just walking each other home, and sometimes that means stopping to help someone along the way." He looked at the homework spread across the table, the college acceptance letters still prominently displayed on the refrigerator. "How's the studying going?" Marcus stretched, rolling his shoulders to relieve the tension of hunching over textbooks. "Good, actually. I finished my English essay on social justice, and I'm working through some practice problems for the calculus test on Friday." He paused, following his father's gaze to the acceptance letter. "Dad, I've been thinking about the college thing. Maybe I should look into community college for the first 2 years, save some money." Joe felt his heart squeeze with a mixture of pride and sadness. Pride that his son was mature enough to think practically about their financial situation, sadness that money might limit Marcus's opportunities. "We'll figure it out, son. Your job is to keep getting good grades and being the kind of person your mother and I raised you to be. Let me worry about the money." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of Joe's phone buzzing with a text message. He glanced at it, expecting a message from his supervisor about tomorrow's schedule, but instead found a message from his sister asking about their weekend plans. The normalcy of the moment, sitting in his warm kitchen with his son while the rain continued to fall outside, felt like a small piece of perfection in a life that often felt like a struggle against impossible odds. Over the next few weeks, Joe found himself occasionally thinking about Catherine Reynolds and wondering how she was doing. He had looked up her name online out of curiosity, but had found nothing more than a few social media profiles that could have belonged to anyone. The encounter had been brief but memorable, one of those moments that reminded him that good people existed in the world, even when the news and daily stress made it easy to forget. Marcus, meanwhile, continued to excel in school, his grades remaining consistently high as he navigated the complex social and academic pressures of his junior year. He had joined the robotics club, where his natural aptitude for engineering and problem-solving made him a valuable team member. The club met twice a week after school, working on projects that challenged the students to apply theoretical knowledge to real-world problems. For Marcus, these sessions were a glimpse into the future he hoped to build for himself, a future where he could use his mind and his hands to create solutions that made people's lives better. The autumn passed quickly, filled with the routine rhythms of work and school that structured their lives. Joe continued working both jobs, his days beginning before dawn at the warehouse and ending late at night with preparation for the next day. The financial pressure remained constant, but he had learned to manage it with the same quiet determination that had carried him through the challenges of single parenthood. Every dollar saved was a step closer to making Marcus's college dreams a reality, and that goal gave purpose to even the most difficult days. As winter approached, Marcus became increasingly involved in a community service project organized by his school. The students were working with a local nonprofit to provide technology education to underprivileged children, teaching basic computer skills and helping with homework. Marcus had volunteered to help with the program, spending Saturday mornings at a community center across town, working with kids who reminded him of his younger self. The work was rewarding, but it also meant taking the bus across the city, a journey that sometimes put him in neighborhoods where a teenager with a backpack and expensive-looking electronics might attract unwanted attention. It was on one of these Saturday mornings in early November that Marcus found himself in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had finished his volunteer session and was walking to the bus stop when he heard the sound of breaking glass behind him. Turning around, he saw that the large window of a convenience store had been shattered, spiderweb cracks spreading across the surface like a frozen explosion. A group of older teenagers was running away from the scene, their laughter echoing off the buildings as they disappeared around a corner. Marcus stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. He could hear sirens in the distance, getting closer, and he knew that staying at the scene might involve him in a situation he wanted no part of. But as he turned to leave, he noticed an elderly man standing in the doorway of the store, looking shaken and confused. The man was holding a phone, obviously having just called the police, and Marcus realized that he couldn't just walk away from someone who might need help. "Are you okay, sir?" Marcus asked, approaching the store owner cautiously. "I saw those kids running away. Did they hurt you?" The elderly man, whose name tag identified him as Mr. Chen, shook his head. No, they didn't hurt me. But they broke my window, and I don't know why. I was just closing up for the morning, and they threw something at the glass." He looked at Marcus with eyes that held both gratitude and suspicion. "You didn't run away like the others." Marcus felt uncomfortable under the man's gaze, aware that his presence at the scene might be misinterpreted. "I was just walking to the bus stop when I heard the glass break. I wanted to make sure you were okay before I left." He could hear the sirens getting closer, and a part of him wanted to continue walking, to avoid any potential complications. But his father's voice echoed in his mind, reminding him that sometimes helping people meant staying when it would be easier to leave. The police arrived within minutes, 2 officers who took in the scene with practiced efficiency. They spoke with Mr. Chen first, getting his account of what had happened, and then turned their attention to Marcus. The questions were routine, but Marcus could feel the weight of their scrutiny as they asked about his presence at the scene, his reason for being in the neighborhood, and whether he had seen the perpetrators. "I volunteer at the community center," Marcus explained, his voice steady despite the anxiety building in his chest. "I teach computer skills to kids on Saturday mornings. I was walking to the bus stop when I heard the glass break." He pointed in the direction the group had run. There were 4 or 5 teenagers, older than me, and they were laughing as they ran away. One of the officers, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, nodded as she took notes. "Can you describe them for us? What they were wearing, their approximate ages, anything that might help us identify them?" Marcus did his best to provide a description, though he had only seen the group briefly and from a distance. As he spoke, he noticed that the second officer was examining his backpack and the electronics visible through the partially open zipper. The officer's expression was neutral, but Marcus felt a chill of apprehension as he realized how the situation might look to someone who didn't know him. "That's an expensive laptop," the officer observed, his tone carefully neutral. "Mind if I ask where you got it?" Marcus felt his heart rate increase. recognizing the implication in the question. My father bought it for me for school. I'm on the honor roll, and I need it for my engineering classes and the robotics club. He reached into his backpack, pulling out his school ID and a letter from his robotics teacher that he carried as proof of his participation in the program. The officer examined the documents, his expression softening slightly. Engineering? That's impressive. What kind of projects are you working on in robotics? As Marcus explained the current project, building a robot that could navigate obstacle courses, he felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. The conversation was beginning to feel less like an interrogation, and more like the kind of exchange he might have with any adult who was interested in his work. But the relief was short-lived, as the officer's radio crackled to life with a report that changed everything. All units, we have a report of vandalism at Chen's Market on 5th Street. Witnesses report seeing a Hispanic male, approximately 16 years old, carrying a backpack and wearing a blue jacket. Consider him a person of interest. Marcus felt the blood drain from his face as he realized that the description matched him almost perfectly. He was wearing a blue jacket, he was 16, and he was standing at the scene of the crime with a backpack. The coincidence was devastating, and he could see the change in the officer's demeanor as they processed the information. "Son, I'm going to need you to come with us," the female officer said, her voice still kind but now carrying the weight of authority. "We need to sort this out properly, and that means taking you down to the station for questioning." Marcus felt panic rising in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. "I didn't do anything wrong. I was just trying to help Mr. Chen. You can call the community center. They'll tell you I was there this morning." His voice was steady, but inside he was terrified. He had heard stories about misunderstandings that spiraled out of control, about young men who found themselves caught up in the legal system through no fault of their own. The officers were professional and respectful, but Marcus still felt the weight of handcuffs as they secured his hands behind his back. The sensation was surreal, transforming him from a helpful citizen into a suspect in a matter of minutes. As they led him to the police car, he caught sight of Mr. Chen watching from the doorway of his store, the elderly man's expression unreadable. The ride to the police station passed in a blur of city streets and growing panic. Marcus tried to focus on the facts, on the truth of what had happened, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had fallen into a trap that was closing around him despite his innocence. He thought about his father, probably at work, and unaware that his son was sitting in the back of a police car, and he wondered how he would explain this situation when it was all over. At the station, Marcus was processed with the same efficiency that the officers had shown at the scene. His belongings were catalogued, his fingerprints were taken, and he was photographed from multiple angles. The process was dehumanizing, reducing him from a person with dreams and ambitions to a case number and a set of identifying characteristics. When they finally allowed him to make a phone call, his hands were shaking as he dialed his father's number. Joe was in the middle of unloading a truck when his phone rang, and he almost didn't answer it when he saw the unfamiliar number. But something made him take the call, and Marcus's voice on the other end of the line hit him like a physical blow. "Dad, I'm at the police station. I need you to come get me. I didn't do anything wrong, but they think I was involved in some vandalism, and I don't know what to do." Marcus's voice was steady, but Joe could hear the fear underneath the words. Joe felt his world tilt on its axis, the familiar warehouse around him suddenly feeling foreign and distant. "I'll be right there, son. Don't say anything to anyone until I get there, okay? We'll figure this out together." He hung up the phone and immediately approached his supervisor, explaining that he had a family emergency and needed to leave immediately. The drive to the police station was the longest 20 minutes of Joe's life. He tried to piece together what might have happened, but nothing made sense. Marcus was a good kid, honor roll student, volunteer at the community center. The idea that he could be involved in vandalism was absurd. But Joe also knew that the legal system didn't always care about a person's character when making decisions about guilt or innocence. At the station, Joe was led to a small conference room where Marcus sat with a public defender who looked like she had been handling cases for about 10 minutes. The lawyer, a young woman named Jennifer Walsh, explained the situation with a mixture of compassion and professional detachment that did nothing to ease Joe's fears. "Your son was in the wrong place at the wrong time," she said, shuffling through papers that seemed to contain Marcus's entire future. A convenience store window was broken, and witnesses saw a Hispanic teenager with a backpack running from the scene. Marcus fits the description, and he was found at the location when police arrived. Joe felt anger building in his chest, the injustice of a situation overwhelming his usual calm demeanor. But he was there to help, not to cause trouble. He volunteers at the community center every Saturday morning. This is all just a misunderstanding. Jennifer Walsh nodded sympathetically. I believe you, and I believe Marcus. But the prosecutor's office sees a pattern of youth crime in that neighborhood, and they're looking to make an example. They're charging him with vandalism and destruction of property. The formal charges were filed 2 days later, and Marcus found himself facing the possibility of a criminal record that could destroy his college dreams before they had a chance to begin. The engineering program he had been accepted to had a strict policy regarding criminal convictions, and even a misdemeanor could result in his admission being revoked. The scholarship opportunities he had been counting on would evaporate, and the future he had worked so hard to build would crumble around him. The weeks leading up to the court date were filled with anxiety and preparation. Jennifer Walsh was doing her best with limited resources, interviewing witnesses and building a case based on character references and alibis. The community center director provided a letter confirming Marcus's volunteer work. His robotics teacher wrote a glowing recommendation, and classmates offered to testify about his character. But Joe couldn't shake the feeling that they were fighting an uphill battle against a system that had already made up its mind. The night before the court date, Joe sat with Marcus in their kitchen, the same place where they had shared countless meals and conversations over the years. The acceptance letter was still on the refrigerator, but now it felt like a mockery of dreams that might never come true. Marcus was trying to study, maintaining his grades even as his future hung in the balance, and Joe was struck by his son's resilience in the face of adversity. Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know how proud I am of you, Joe said, his voice thick with emotion. You've handled this whole situation with more maturity than most adults would show. Your mother would be proud too. Marcus looked up from his textbook, his eyes bright with unshed tears. I keep thinking about that morning, wondering if I should have just walked away when I saw what happened. Maybe none of this would have happened if I had minded my own business. Joe reached across the table, placing his hand over his son's. You did exactly what you should have done. You saw someone who needed help, and you stayed to help them. That's who you are, Marcus, and I never want you to change that about yourself, no matter what happens tomorrow. The courthouse was an imposing building of marble and glass, its architecture designed to inspire both respect and intimidation. Joe and Marcus arrived early, accompanied by Jennifer Walsh, who had prepared them for what to expect during the proceedings. The hallways were filled with people navigating their own legal challenges, a cross-section of humanity dealing with the complexities of the justice system. As they waited for Marcus's case to be called, Joe found himself studying the other families in the hallway, recognizing the same mixture of hope and fear that he felt in his own chest. Some looked resigned to their fate, others appeared defiant, and a few seemed to carry the quiet confidence of people who believed in their innocence. Joe wasn't sure which category he and Marcus fell into, but he knew that whatever happened, they would face it together. When Marcus's name was finally called, they entered a courtroom that felt both smaller and more imposing than Joe had expected. The judge's bench dominated the room, elevated above the rest of the proceedings like a throne of justice. Jennifer Walsh had explained that they would be appearing before Judge Catherine Reynolds, a recently retired judge who was filling in for a colleague who had fallen ill. The name meant nothing to Joe, just another part of a system that seemed designed to overwhelm and intimidate. As they took their seats at the defendant's table, Joe noticed that the prosecutor looked confident, shuffling through papers with the casual efficiency of someone who had handled hundreds of similar cases. The evidence against Marcus was largely circumstantial, but Joe knew that innocent people were convicted on circumstantial evidence all the time. The thought made his stomach clench with anxiety. The bailiff called the court to order, and Joe looked up as the judge entered the courtroom. Time seemed to slow as he took in the familiar figure walking to the bench, the silver hair now styled professionally, the navy blue dress replaced by the black robes of judicial authority. Judge Catherine Reynolds settled into her seat and looked out over the courtroom, her gaze sweeping across the assembled attorneys and defendants before settling on Joe's face. For a moment, neither of them moved, the recognition mutual and electric. Joe saw the slight widening of her eyes, the almost imperceptible pause as she processed the coincidence that had brought them together again. Catherine Reynolds, the woman he had helped change a tire in the rain 6 months ago, was now sitting in judgment of his son's future. Catherine felt her heart rate increase as she recognized Joe Martinez sitting in her courtroom, the same man who had stopped to help her on that rainy night when she was stranded and vulnerable. The irony of the situation was not lost on her, the way that fate had arranged for their paths to cross again under circumstances that neither of them could have imagined. She forced herself to maintain her professional composure, but inside she was reeling from the implications of the moment. The prosecutor began his opening statement, outlining the charges against Marcus and presenting the evidence that had led to his arrest. The case was straightforward from his perspective. A window had been broken. The teenager matching the defendant's description had been seen running from the scene, and Marcus had been found at the location when police arrived. The fact that he had expensive electronics in his backpack suggested possible motivation, and his presence in a neighborhood where he didn't live raised questions about his activities. As the prosecutor spoke, Catherine found herself studying Marcus Martinez, looking for resemblances to the father who had helped her without expectation of reward. The young man sat quietly beside his attorney, his posture straight and his expression serious, but not defiant. There was something in his demeanor that reminded her of Joe, a quiet dignity that suggested strength of character even in the face of adversity. Jennifer Walsh presented the defense with passion and conviction, outlining Marcus's exemplary academic record, his volunteer work at the community center, and the circumstances that had led to his presence at the scene. She called witnesses who testified to his character, including the director of the community center, who confirmed his Saturday morning volunteer schedule. The robotics teacher spoke eloquently about Marcus's dedication and integrity, painting a picture of a young man who was far more likely to help solve problems than create them. Throughout the testimony, Catherine found herself thinking about her conversation with Joe on that rainy night, his obvious pride in his son's academic achievements, and his determination to support Marcus's college dreams. She remembered the way Joe had spoken about working 2 jobs to save for tuition, the sacrifice and dedication that had been evident in every word. Now she was seeing the result of that parenting, a young man who had been raised with values that led him to help others, even when it might complicate his own life. When it came time for Marcus to testify on his own behalf, Catherine watched him carefully as he took the stand. His voice was steady as he explained his presence at the scene, his decision to stay and help Mr. Chen, and his shock at being arrested for a crime he didn't commit. There was no bravado in his testimony, no attempt to minimize the seriousness of the charges, just a straightforward account of what had happened from his perspective. "I know it looks bad," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the courtroom with quiet conviction. "I know that being there when the police arrived makes me look guilty, but I was raised to help people when they need it, even if it's inconvenient or complicated. When I saw Mr. Chen standing there looking shaken up, I couldn't just walk away. That's not who I am." The prosecutor's cross-examination was aggressive but not cruel, an attempt to find inconsistencies in Marcus's story or to suggest alternative explanations for his presence at the scene. But Marcus's testimony remained consistent, his answers honest and direct, even when they didn't necessarily help his case. Catherine found herself impressed by his maturity and his refusal to compromise his integrity, even when facing serious charges. As the testimony concluded and the attorneys made their closing arguments, Catherine felt the weight of the decision that lay before her. The evidence was largely circumstantial, but it was also compelling from a prosecutor's perspective. Marcus had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and his presence at the scene could reasonably be interpreted as suspicious. But she also knew things about Joe Martinez that the court record couldn't capture, things that spoke to the character of the man who had raised this young defendant. The courtroom fell silent as Catherine prepared to render her verdict, the weight of Marcus's future hanging in the balance. She looked out over the assembled participants, her gaze taking in the prosecutor's confident expression, Jennifer Walsh's nervous hope, and the quiet dignity of Joe and Marcus Martinez. This was the moment that would determine whether a promising young man would have the opportunity to pursue his dreams or would be forced to carry the burden of a criminal conviction for the rest of his life. In considering this case, Catherine began, her voice carrying the authority of decades on the bench, I have had to weigh the evidence presented against the character of the defendant and the circumstances that led to his presence at the scene of the alleged crime. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the courtroom. The prosecution has presented a circumstantial case based on the defendant's presence at the scene and his general description matching that of the perpetrator. However, circumstantial evidence must be compelling and consistent to support a conviction, and in this case, I find significant reasonable doubt." End quote. Joe felt his heart hammering in his chest as he listened to the judge's measured words, afraid to hope, but unable to suppress the growing sense that the verdict might be favorable. Beside him, Marcus sat perfectly still, his attention focused entirely on Catherine's words. The defendant has presented credible testimony about his reason for being in the neighborhood, supported by documentation of his volunteer work and character references from multiple sources. His decision to remain at the scene to offer assistance to the victim is consistent with the character described by witnesses and inconsistent with the behavior of someone who had just committed a crime. End quote. Catherine's gaze found Joe's face in the gallery, and for a moment, their eyes met across the formal distance of the courtroom. She saw the same quiet strength that had impressed her that night in the rain, the same fundamental decency that had led him to help a stranger without expectation of reward. Furthermore, she continued, the defendant's conduct during these proceedings has been exemplary. He has shown respect for the court, honesty in his testimony, and a maturity that speaks well of his character and upbringing. Based on all of these factors, I find the defendant not guilty of all charges. The words hit Joe like a physical force, relief flooding through him so completely that he felt momentarily dizzy. Beside him, Marcus exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping as the tension that had been building for weeks finally released. Jennifer Walsh was smiling, gathering her papers with the satisfied efficiency of someone who had just won a difficult case. As the courtroom began to empty, Catherine called out, "Mr. Martinez, could I see you in my chambers for a moment?" Joe followed the bailiff to the judge's private office, his mind racing as he tried to process what had just happened. The relief of Marcus's acquittal was still washing over him, but now he was curious about why Judge Reynolds wanted to speak with him privately. The bailiff led him through a door behind the bench, down a short hallway lined with legal texts and certificates, to an office that managed to be both imposing and welcoming. Catherine had already removed her judicial robes, revealing the same understated elegance that Joe remembered from their first meeting. She gestured for him to take a seat in one of the comfortable chairs arranged in front of her desk, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The formal atmosphere of the courtroom had given way to something more personal, though the weight of what had just transpired still hung in the air between them. "I suppose you're wondering why I asked you here," Catherine said, settling into her chair with the same grace she had shown on that rainy night. "And I suppose you've already figured out that this isn't the first time we've met." Joe nodded, finding his voice after a moment of processing. "Catherine Reynolds, I helped you change a tire about 6 months ago, during that big storm in November. I never imagined I'd see you again, especially not like this. Especially not with your son standing trial in my courtroom," Catherine added, her expression thoughtful. "When I saw you sitting there today, I have to admit, it took everything I had to maintain my professional composure." The irony of the situation was not lost on me. Joe leaned forward slightly, his curiosity overcoming his natural deference to authority. "Can I ask you something? Did our meeting, did it influence your decision today? Because if it did, I need to know. Marcus deserves to be found innocent because he is innocent, not because his father once helped you with a flat tire." "Ah," Catherine smiled, the expression transforming her features and reminding Joe of the grateful woman he had met on the roadside. "That's exactly the kind of question I would expect from the man who refused payment for helping a stranger in the rain. And I can tell you with complete honesty that my decision today was based entirely on the evidence and testimony presented in court." End quote. She paused, her fingers drumming lightly on the desk as she chose her words carefully. "But I won't lie to you, Joe. Knowing your character, seeing the kind of man you are, it helped me understand the kind of father Marcus has had. It helped me recognize the values that shaped the young man I saw testifying today." Joe felt a complex mixture of emotions, gratitude and pride, warring with a lingering concern about the ethics of the situation. I appreciate you telling me that, and I want you to know that Marcus really is a good kid. He's never been in trouble, never given me a moment's worry about his character or his choices. I could see that, Catherine replied. Everything about his testimony, his demeanor, his responses to cross-examination, it all spoke to a young man who was raised with strong values and a clear moral compass. That doesn't happen by accident, Joe. That's the result of good parenting, of a father who models the behavior he wants to see in his son. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door, and Marcus appeared in the doorway, looking uncertain about whether he should enter. Catherine gestured for him to come in, and Joe felt a surge of pride as his son approached with the same respectful confidence he had shown throughout the ordeal. "Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice steady but humble, "I wanted to thank you for giving me a fair hearing today. I know the situation looked bad, and I appreciate that you were willing to look beyond the surface to see the correct truth." Catherine studied the young man standing before her, seeing in his face the same fundamental decency that had impressed her about his father. "Marcus, I want you to know that you conducted yourself with remarkable maturity throughout this process. Many adults would have struggled to maintain their composure under the pressure you faced." Marcus nodded, his expression serious. "My father always taught me that your character is revealed not when things are easy, but when they're difficult. I tried to remember that every day since this started." "Your father is a wise man," Catherine replied, glancing at Joe with an expression that carried layers of meaning. "And you're fortunate to have had such a strong role model. But I also want you to know that the character you showed in court, the integrity and honesty, that came from within you. Your father may have provided the foundation, but you built the structure." Joe felt his throat tighten with emotion as he listened to the exchange between his son and the judge. The pride he felt was almost overwhelming, not just because Marcus had been cleared of the charges, but because of the way he had handled himself throughout the entire ordeal. The young man standing before them was someone who would make a positive difference in the world, regardless of what challenges he might face. "There's something else I wanted to discuss with you both," Catherine said, her tone shifting to something more businesslike. "Marcus, your attorney mentioned that you've been accepted to the State University's engineering program. How are you planning to finance your education?" Marcus glanced at his father, uncertainty flickering across his features. "We're still working on that, Your Honor. I've applied for scholarships, and my father has been saving money, but college is expensive. We're hoping to figure out a way to make it work." Catherine nodded thoughtfully. "I may be able to help with that. I serve on the board of a foundation that provides scholarships to deserving students, particularly those who have demonstrated strong character and a commitment to community service. Based on what I've seen today and what I know about your volunteer work, I think you would be an excellent candidate." Joe felt his world shift again, but this time in a direction he hadn't dared to hope for. The possibility of scholarship money, of real financial assistance for Marcus's education, was like a dream he had never allowed himself to fully imagine. "That's incredibly generous of you, Your Honor, but I have to ask, is this because of what happened that night? Because if it is, I can't accept charity." Catherine's expression grew serious. "Joe, this isn't charity, and it's not because you helped me change a tire. This is about recognizing and supporting young people who have the potential to make meaningful contributions to society. Marcus has demonstrated academic excellence, community involvement, and personal integrity. Those are exactly the qualities we look for in scholarship recipients." End quote. She turned to Marcus, her expression warming. "The foundation I work with specifically supports students who are interested in engineering and who have showed a commitment to helping others. Your volunteer work at the community center, your academic achievements, and frankly, your behavior during this legal challenge all make you an ideal candidate." End quote. Marcus looked stunned, his usual composure cracking slightly as he processed what Judge Reynolds was saying. "I don't know what to say, Your Honor. This is more than I ever hoped for." "Say that you'll continue to be the kind of person who stays to help when others run away," Catherine replied. "Say that you'll use your education to make the world a better place. Say that you'll remember that sometimes the most important thing you can do is to pay it forward." The phrase hit Joe like a physical blow. The same words he had said to Catherine on that rainy night coming back to him in a moment of perfect circular symmetry. He looked at the judge, seeing in her eyes the same recognition of the moment's significance. "You helped me when I was invisible," Catherine said, her voice soft but clear. "You didn't know who I was, what I did for a living, whether I had money or influence. You just saw someone who needed help, and you provided it without expectation of reward. That's the kind of character that deserves to be recognized and supported." Joe felt tears prick his eyes, the emotion of the day finally overwhelming his usual restraint. "I never expected anything like this. I just did what anyone should do in that situation." "But not everyone would have done it," Catherine replied firmly. "Not everyone would have stopped in the rain to help a stranger. Not everyone would have refused payment and simply asked that the kindness be passed along. You did, and now I have the opportunity to honor that request." The scholarship application process took several weeks, but Catherine's recommendation carried significant weight with the Foundation's board. Marcus's academic records, character references, and essay about his commitment to using engineering to solve social problems impressed the selection committee. When the letter arrived announcing that he had been awarded a full scholarship, Joe had to read it 3 times before he could believe it was real. The scholarship covered not just tuition, but also room and board, books, and a stipend for living expenses. It was more than Joe had dared to hope for, more than he had ever imagined possible. But perhaps more importantly, it represented recognition of Marcus's potential and a vote of confidence in his future. The summer before Marcus left for college was filled with preparation and reflection. Joe found himself thinking often about the chain of events that had led to this moment, the way that a simple act of kindness had rippled forward in ways he could never have anticipated. He had helped Catherine change a tire because it was the right thing to do, never imagining that she would one day be in a position to help his son in return. As they packed Marcus's belongings for the move to the university, Joe came across the original acceptance letter that had sat on their refrigerator for so many months. The paper was slightly faded now, but the words still carried the same weight of possibility. What had seemed like an impossible dream was now becoming reality, and Joe felt a profound sense of gratitude for the unexpected turns that life had taken. "Dad," Marcus said, looking up from the boxes scattered around his room, "I want you to know that I understand what a sacrifice this has been for you. Even with the scholarship, I know you've given up a lot to support my dreams." Joe paused in his packing, considering his son's words. "Marcus, everything I've done, every extra hour I've worked, every sacrifice I've made, it's all been worth it to see you have the opportunities you have now. Your mother and I, we always believed that education was the key to building a better life, and you've proven us right. I want to make you proud," Marcus replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I want to use this opportunity to do something meaningful with my life." "You already have made me proud," Joe said, crossing the room to embrace his son. "Every day, in 100 different ways, you make me proud to be your father. The man you've become, the character you've shown, that's worth more than any degree or career success." The night before Marcus left for college, they sat together on the small balcony of their apartment, looking out over the city lights and reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The scholarship had eliminated the financial pressure that had weighed so heavily on both of them, but more than that, it had validated their belief that good things could happen to good people. "Do you ever think about that night you helped Judge Reynolds?" Marcus asked, his voice quiet in the darkness. "How different things might have been if you had just driven past." Joe considered the question, thinking about the random chances and unexpected connections that had shaped their lives. "I think about it sometimes, but not in the way you might expect. I don't think about it as lucky or unlucky, just as part of the way life works. You do the right thing because it's right, not because you expect something in return. Sometimes good things happen as a result, sometimes they don't, but that's not the point." "Ah. But aren't you glad you stopped?" Marcus pressed. "Aren't you grateful for the way things worked out?" Joe smiled, reaching over to put his hand on his son's shoulder. "I'm grateful for a lot of things, Marcus. I'm grateful for the scholarship, for Judge Reynolds' kindness, for the opportunity you have ahead of you. But mostly, I'm grateful for the son I've raised, for the man you've become, and for the values that guided both of us through this whole experience." The drive to the university the next morning was filled with the nervous excitement that comes with major life transitions. Marcus had been to the campus several times for orientation and preparation, but this was different. This was the beginning of his real independence, the start of the journey that would take him from his father's son to his own man. As they unloaded boxes in the dormitory parking lot, Joe felt a mixture of pride and melancholy that every parent experiences when their child takes this step toward adulthood. The scholarship had made this moment possible, but it was Marcus's character and determination that would carry him through the challenges ahead. "Remember," Joe said as they carried the last box up to Marcus's room, "this is just the beginning. The scholarship got you here, but what you do with this opportunity is up to you. Work hard, be kind to others, and never forget where you came from." "Ah." Marcus nodded, his expression serious but excited. "I won't forget, Dad. And I won't forget the lesson you taught me about helping others. Judge Reynolds was right. The most important thing is to pay it forward." As Joe prepared to leave his son at college and drive home alone for the first time in 18 years, he reflected on the unexpected ways that life had rewarded their commitment to doing the right thing. The scholarship was wonderful, but the real gift was the knowledge that Marcus was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, armed with the values and character that would serve him well in any situation. 6 months later, Joe received a call from Catherine Reynolds, who had kept in touch periodically to check on Marcus's progress. She had news that she wanted to share, an update on the foundation's work that she thought Joe would appreciate. "The scholarship program has grown significantly this year," she told him, her voice warm with satisfaction. "We've been able to help 12 students, and Marcus has become something of a poster child for the program. His academic performance has been exceptional, and his continued volunteer work has impressed everyone." Joe felt a familiar surge of pride at hearing about his son's success. Marcus had indeed thrived at the university, maintaining a high GPA while participating in engineering competitions and continuing his community service work. The young man who had once faced criminal charges was now mentoring other students and working on projects that could benefit society. "There's something else," Catherine continued. "The Foundation Board has decided to establish a new scholarship specifically for students who have demonstrated exceptional character in the face of adversity. We're calling it the Martinez Scholarship, and we'd like to ask both of you to help us select the recipients." Joe felt overwhelmed by the honor, the idea that his son's name would be associated with helping other young people achieve their dreams. "Catherine, I don't know what to say. This is incredible." "It's fitting," she replied. "Marcus has become an inspiration to other students, proof that character and integrity can overcome even the most challenging circumstances. And you, Joe, you've shown that the values we teach our children really do matter in the real world." The Martinez Scholarship was announced at a ceremony attended by Foundation board members, scholarship recipients, and their families. Joe watched with tears in his eyes as Marcus spoke about the importance of helping others and the responsibility that comes with receiving support from the community. The young man who had once stood trial for a crime he didn't commit was now helping to ensure that other deserving students would have the opportunities he had received. As the ceremony concluded and the families began to mingle, Joe found himself approached by a young woman who looked familiar. She was perhaps 25, professionally dressed, with the confident bearing of someone who had achieved success through hard work and determination. "Mr. Martinez," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Sarah Chen, and I wanted to thank you for what you did for my grandfather." Joe felt a moment of confusion before the name clicked into place. "Chen, are you related to the store owner? The gentleman whose window was broken?" Sarah nodded, her expression warm with gratitude. "My grandfather told me about how your son stayed to help him that day, even though it would have been easier to just walk away. He said Marcus showed him kindness when he was scared and confused, and that meant more to him than you might know." The conversation continued for several minutes, with Sarah explaining that her grandfather had been struggling with the isolation and fear that often affect elderly business owners in challenging neighborhoods. Marcus's simple act of staying to help had restored some of his faith in the younger generation and had given him hope that there were still good people in the world. "Marcus doesn't know this," Sarah said. "But my grandfather has been following his story, rooting for him throughout the legal process and celebrating his success at the university. He wanted me to tell you that he's proud of the young man you raised. Joe felt the familiar tightness in his throat that came with unexpected emotion. The ripple effects of that day continued to spread, touching lives in ways that none of them had anticipated. Marcus's decision to stay and help, even at personal cost, had created connections and impacts that extended far beyond the immediate situation. As the evening wound down and the families began to leave, Joe found himself standing with Catherine and Marcus, looking out over the group of scholarship recipients and their families. The room was filled with hope and possibility, with young people who had been given the chance to pursue their dreams because of the generosity and foresight of others. "You know what strikes me most about all of this?" Catherine said, her voice thoughtful. "It started with such a simple thing, a flat tire, a man who stopped to help, a choice to do the right thing without expecting anything in return, and look what it's become." Marcus nodded, his expression serious. "It's made me think differently about every interaction I have with people. You never know when a small kindness might change someone's entire trajectory." Joe looked at his son, seeing the wisdom that had grown from experience and reflection. "Your mother used to say that we're all connected in ways we don't always understand, that what we do for others, we do for ourselves and for the world. I think she would be proud of what you've become, Marcus." The drive home that night was filled with a sense of completion and continuity. The scholarship program would continue to help deserving students. Marcus would continue to excel in his studies and service to others, and Joe would continue to model the values that had guided them through their unexpected journey. The flat tire that had brought Catherine and Joe together had become the foundation for something much larger, a legacy of kindness and support that would extend far beyond their individual lives. 2 years later, Marcus graduated at the top of his engineering class, with job offers from several prestigious companies and admission to graduate school. But perhaps more importantly, he had become a leader in community service, organizing volunteer projects that brought university students together with local schools and community organizations. The young man who had once been accused of vandalism had become a force for positive change in his community. At his graduation ceremony, Marcus was recognized not just for his academic achievements, but for his character and service. As he walked across the stage to receive his diploma, Joe felt a profound sense of accomplishment and gratitude. The journey that had begun with a flat tire in the rain had led to this moment, and beyond it to a future filled with possibility and purpose. Catherine was there for the ceremony, having become something of a family friend over the years. As they celebrated Marcus's achievement, she reflected on the unexpected ways that life had rewarded their commitment to doing the right thing. The scholarship program had grown to help dozens of students, Marcus had become a role model for character and service, and Joe had proven that the values he held dear could indeed make a difference in the world. "You know," Catherine said to Joe, as they watched Marcus celebrate with his classmates, "I've been thinking about that night we met. I was stranded, vulnerable, and you stopped to help without knowing anything about me. But in a way, I think you were the one who was really being helped that night." Joe looked at her with curiosity. "How do you mean?" "You were given the opportunity to be the person you wanted to be, to live up to the values you believe in. And because you took that opportunity, because you chose to be kind when you could have just driven past, you set in motion a chain of events that has touched dozens of lives. Marcus's scholarship, the foundation's work, the other students we've helped. It all traces back to that moment when you chose to stop." Joe considered her words, thinking about the ripple effects of that night and all that had followed. "I think you're right, but not in the way you might expect. I think we all get chances to be the people we want to be, to live up to our values. The question is whether we recognize those chances and take them, or whether we let them pass by." Marcus approached them, his face bright with excitement and gratitude. "I wanted to thank you both again for everything you've done for me. Judge Reynolds, the scholarship changed my life, and Dad, you've been the foundation for everything I've achieved." Catherine smiled, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Marcus, you've earned every opportunity you've received. Your father may have provided the foundation, and the scholarship may have opened doors, but you've done the work. You've shown that character and integrity really do matter in the world. As the celebration continued around them, Joe reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The flat tire had been just the beginning, a random event that had revealed the connections and possibilities that exist when people choose to treat each other with kindness and respect. Marcus's success was gratifying, but the real satisfaction came from knowing that they had remained true to their values throughout the entire experience. The story of Joe Martinez and Catherine Reynolds became something of a legend in their community, passed down as an example of how small acts of kindness can create large changes in the world. But for Joe, the most important lesson was simpler, that doing the right thing, even when it's difficult or inconvenient, is its own reward. The scholarship, the recognition, the success, all of that was wonderful, but the real gift was the knowledge that he had raised a son who would carry those values forward into the next generation. Years later, when Marcus had children of his own, he would tell them the story of their grandfather's flat tire and how a simple act of kindness had changed their family's trajectory. He would teach them that you help others, not because of what you might get in return, but because it's the right thing to do. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the world finds a way to reward that kindness in ways you never could have imagined. The Marcus Martinez Scholarship continued to help students for decades, becoming one of the most prestigious awards in the region. Each recipient learned a story of how the scholarship began, with a flat tire and a father who stopped to help a stranger. They learned that character matters, that integrity has value, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is to pay it forward. In the end, Joe Martinez's decision to stop and help Catherine Reynolds that rainy night had created something far more valuable than either of them had imagined. It had created a legacy of kindness, a demonstration that good people exist in the world, and a reminder that we are all connected in ways we don't always understand. The flat tire had been fixed in 20 minutes, but the impact of that simple act of kindness would last for generations.